So before the onset of the pandemic in 2020, the defence economic trends in the Gulf were already incredibly volatile and actually in a quite constrained trend as it was. So where in other regions economic growth does tend to dictate wider defence budget movements, what we find in the Gulf is that it's really the oil price that dictates what happens to wider defence expenditure. So you can quite clearly track improvements in the oil price or cuts in the oil price to what happens to defence expenditure in these key markets. So even before the emergence of the pandemic and the consequent economic impact and the further reduction in the oil price over the course of 2020, a few countries had already announced cuts to defence expenditure. So in December 2019, we saw Saudi Arabia announce a wider public spending cut of around 3%, and within that, defence was, or rather the military, was not ring-fenced. The military saw an 8% cut in their budget for 2020. And so when you consider that and the fact that over the course of 2020, several countries have also announced further public spending cuts, we also have the fact that the IMF has downgraded the economic projections of these countries. So if you consider the October 2019 economic outlook from the IMF, it was 3 to 4% growth in the GCC. And now, over the course of 2020, we've seen that economic projection be downgraded. So we're now looking at, in the latest outlook, the October release, we're looking at a 6 to 7% contraction in these countries. So while you do have these economic constraints, what will always drive the trends in this region are the security and political drivers. If you consider wider defence budget drivers to have three pillars, your economic, political and strategic. Strategic has always been the primary driver of budget trends, or rather the allocation to defence within public spending within these countries. And so those dynamics haven't really changed. The security threat profile is still there. So even though you have that weaker economic footing, you still have those other two drivers propping up defence expenditure. So where we will see urgent operational requirements emerge or evolving threats even, this might then lead to a refocus on defence procurement, and it's not necessarily that it will be cut, it will be slightly different programmes that are pursued. Because what we saw in previous years was that it was conventional capabilities and major procurement projects that were the focus, and now we might see more targeted acquisition approach, which also feeds into the Gulf's focus on self-sufficiency going forward. So the impact that the pandemic may have on Gulf defence industrial ambitions is difficult to determine at this point, but it is likely that these countries will continue to pursue self-sufficiency and technology transfer within procurement programmes. And indeed, as other countries find that their domestic markets are more constrained, that they're now looking for those export markets, and in a time of really quite tight defence budgets elsewhere, then even though you have a weaker bargaining power because you're on a weaker economic footing, the fact that all countries are in that position means that you probably will be able to continue with those demands within procurement practices. So countries are likely to continue their strategies, so Saudi Arabia's Vision 2030, which is looking at 50% indigenous production within defence. And I think that given one of the consequences of the pandemic has been to increase that focus on resilience and securing your supply chain, I would imagine that these countries will continue with that pursuit as well, simply because in order to shore up that supply and really make it secure in terms of your military capabilities and your security of supply. So I think these countries will continue to pursue that. The other aspect is that the region as a whole accounted for about a quarter of global defence exports between 2014 and 2019. So it's a really crucial key export market. And it was also instrumental in the recovery of defence expenditure following the last crisis. So given the importance of this market and the fact that there is still that reliance on imports and the need for these newer technologies, counter UAVs or missile defence, Those will still be the focus because they answer an urgent operational requirement, and they're still hugely crucial to the security of the region.